Was an article in the Baton Rouge newspaper this morning headed, "Troops Warned to be Aware of Ramadan." Goes on to say, it's Dateline in Saudi Arabia. It says, American and British commanders Friday warned soldiers not to eat, drink, or smoke in public during daylight when the Muslim fasting month of Ramadan begins sometime in the next few days. Now, just stop for just a second. I'd like to call your attention to a couple of things. Primarily the fact that they didn't give a date for the beginning of Ramadan. They said, when the Muslim fasting month of Ramadan begins sometime in the next few days. Now, do you know why they said, well, it's going to start sometime in the next few days? There's a reason for that. When, a few minutes ago, when I, in the announcements, announced the time of Passover, I was able to tell you exactly when we're going to have Passover service. I didn't say, well, now we're going to have it Thursday, or we may have it Friday or Saturday. We haven't settled on that yet. I didn't have to say that. We know when the days of unleavened bread are going to begin. We know when the first holy day is. We're able to announce it ahead of time. Now, the newspaper said the Muslim fasting month of Ramadan begins sometime in the next few days. Now, the Muslims celebrate this month. They call it a month of fasting. In reality, they fast for a month. That's right. They fast from sunrise to sunset. They feast all evening. And then they fast during the daytime. Now that's not really that rough. You can eat as much as you want between sunset and sunrise. In fact, they have quite a festive party, every evening. But from sunrise to sunset during the daylight portion, needless to say, the whole nation of Saudi Arabia just kind of shuts down for the month. There's not a whole lot going on during the day. In fact, what it amounts to is, in a lot of cases, many of them will everything works on short schedule because a lot of them will take time off and sleep quite a bit during the day because they're going to stay up all night and make the best of the only time they have to eat. So it really, chances are, depending on when you had supper last night, you may have fasted from sunset to sunrise. That's not uncommon, If you had an early supper, you may not have considered that you were really depriving yourself and really fasting. If you ate supper and a few hours later you went to bed. I got up this morning and it was after sunrise before you had your morning cup of coffee, then you'd fasted just like they had. You just kind of reversed it there. So anyway, it's not quite as rigorous as some of the Americans who were commenting on it. They thought that was awfully rough. Somebody had to fast all day, but not as bad as they may think. Now, the article goes on to say, because I made comment of the fact that they're not sure when it's going to start, and we are sure when our festivals are going to start. Now, there's a reason why not. Said Ramadan is a movable fast. It begins on Saturday if the crescent moon is sighted Friday night by at least 2 men who must testify before an Islamic tribunal. Otherwise, it begins on Sunday. Now, you know why that is? They are observing the new moon. And the new moon is that first little faint crescent that appears. And depending on whether or not 2 of them could see it, there had to be at least 2 who claimed to see it. Now, I would suspect that from what I've read of the situation in Kuwait right now, that it could be a full moon. And they still may have trouble seeing it with all the black smoke in the air. So they may have difficulty trying to find out when the new moon has appeared. You're going to have to rely on somebody from Saudi Arabia, and you're in bad shape if it's like it was here last night. If we had to depend on observing the new moon, it was raining in Baton Rouge last night. I don't know about where you are, but it was pretty wet over here. We had a cloud cover. If we had been depending on observing the new moon, we would have been in trouble because I would have had to get up today, brethren, and say, well, brethren, we're not sure when we're going to have the Passover because it was cloudy last night and nobody was able to see the new moon. And this is, of course, the problem that they run into. The Muslim calendar is in some ways derived from the sacred calendar that is the basis of the holy days. But except for one fact, it is strictly a lunar calendar. It is strictly based on the moon, and it is not based on calculation, but rather on observation. So, depending on the evening and depending on whether or not you can see, there have to be at least two good Muslims who can testify that they saw it. If they are able to see it, well then that will they will begin their count. Now, whether they saw it or not, last night was a new moon. That's why today is the first day of the sacred year. And that's why we know when we're going to observe the Passover and when we are going to observe God's annual festivals. We're entering the festival season, and certainly here today in a special way. I would like today to focus our attention on some of the instructions that God gives us regarding the festivals in general, regarding our observation of the festivals, and particularly the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover season, which is coming. Now, in Genesis chapter 1, we're told, of course, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. We find that God began the process of going through the 7 days, is what are called the 7 days of creation, which in the most literal sense was really a recreating, because God had created the heavens and the earth in the beginning. The Bible does not date that period, but we know from putting it together with other scriptures in Isaiah 14 and other places, Ezekiel 28, Revelation 12, we know that there was a world, a pre-Adamic world, a world that existed prior to the time of God creating Adam and Eve upon the earth. There was a time, there was a world that was under the rulership of Lucifer and his angels. That world may very well have lasted for even billions of years. The Bible does not define that. And frankly, when you're talking in terms of that sort of time, that is time that is incomprehensible on the human level. But the point remains that ultimately Lucifer rebelled, and there was a destruction that took place, and then God stepped in, and in 6 days reformed and refashioned and made suitable for human habitation this earth, this solar system, and finally on the 6th day introduced human life in the form of Adam and Eve, and then rested on the Sabbath. And that is detailed in a day-by-day account in Genesis chapter 1. And in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 14, we're told, God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament," or in the expanse of the heaven. "Let there be two lights that appear clearly and distinctly in the sky, that will serve to divide the day from the night. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." Let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so, and God made or appointed the two great lights. The greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. So, here we have this was the 4th day. Here we have God making plain, as we find earlier, there was a tremendous amount of debris that totally blacked out any light from reaching the earth's surface. And the first thing God did was to clear away and to create an atmosphere on the first day that allowed light to penetrate to the earth's surface. Now, there were other things that were involved, which undoubtedly involved both the establishing of the tilt of the earth's axis, the ordering of the moon's orbit around the earth and the earth's orbit around the sun. All were fixed in the way that we are conscious of them today. And God made it so, and the sun and the moon are there not only to give light in daytime and at night, but they are there for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. Now, what does that mean? Well, the word for signs here is a word that is a sort of a broad word. It is used throughout the Hebrew word for signs is a word used throughout the Old Testament that relates to signs or something that is a sign or is a mark. It's derived from the same word that's used in Genesis 4 when it talks about God setting up a mark for Cain. It is something to identify. God put and appointed the sun and the moon in the way that they function, the moon in its orbit and the earth in its orbit around the sun. The movements that appear to take place from the perspective of the earth, God established those for the purpose of identifying certain things. This word signs does not have some sort of astrological significance or something of that sort. It doesn't mean some days are lucky and some are unlucky. It means that they're there for the purpose of identity. They identify and are the basis of defining all of the things that relate to time. You know, if you think about it, time is something that relates to man and it relates to the earth. You know, time did not exist before God created it. You know, God didn't need time. He inhabits eternity. That kind of blows our mind. We can't imagine that. You know, how could there be something if there wasn't time? Well, God, in the book of Revelation, we're told that there will come a time when we're said that there will be time no more. That time is something that has relevance for the physical world, has relevance for human beings. We inhabit time and space. God inhabits eternity, Isaiah tells us. God inhabits eternity. Time is defined by the earth's rotation on its axis, by the earth's revolution around the sun, by the moon's revolution around the earth. You know, the length of the day is not some arbitrary period that is set. The length of the day is based on the length of time it takes the earth to rotate on its axis. The earth rotates on its axis approximately every 24 hours. Now, not exactly 24 hours. That's why there's a difference from sunset one day to sunset the next. Now, while the earth is rotating on its axis, it's also doing something else. It is revolving around the sun. Now, the earth, if you've ever looked at a globe, the earth sits with a particular tilt. If you were to take, for instance, you could take like a styrofoam ball and put a straw or a little thin stick through it to where it would come through at an angle. Now, what you find if you think of it, the earth has a tilt to its axis, and if this is the North Pole and this is the South, and the earth revolves around the sun, it takes it approximately 365 days to do that, but the earth revolves around the sun. One thing that you know, that there is a time when the North Pole, when the tilt of the earth's axis, the North Pole is pointed toward the sun. Then when you get around to the other side, the South Pole is pointed toward the sun, the North Pole is tilted away. And there's a time, obviously, when they're both at about the same distance, and they're neither one that are tilted exactly toward it. This is where our seasons come from. You see, the time when the North Pole, the northern hemisphere, is tilted toward the sun, is the time that we call summer. It's the time between the spring and the fall when the days are longer than the nights. The time when the northern hemisphere, the North Pole, is tilted away from the sun is the time we call winter. It's the time between fall and spring when the nights are longer than the days. Now, God established it so. He set the sun and the moon, and He established these orbits. He established them there to define time. So we have the day based on the fact of the Earth's rotation on its axis. That's why the sun appears to rise and set. In reality, of course, it's the Earth that is revolving on its axis as it is gradually making its way around the sun. Now, while the Earth is going around, is rotating on its axis and revolving around the sun, there's also something else taking place, and that is that the moon is rotating around the Earth. The moon is rotating around the Earth. And the moon rotates around the Earth approximately every 29 days. Every 29 and a half days approximately. The word for month is derived from the word for moon. You see, time was regulated by the interaction of the Earth, the sun, and the moon. Our days are based on sunrise and sunset, or what appears to be sunrise and sunset. From the perspective of standing on the Earth, it's actually the Earth rotating. Our seasons are based on the fact that the Earth goes around the sun. And there are seasons that are established. That's the basis of seasonal variation. The fact that there is that in the northern hemisphere, days are longer in the summer and shorter in the winter. That's why, if you've ever read how up in a certain area, up above the Arctic Circle, there's time during the summer when the sun never sets, and there's time during the winter when it never rises. Because that is right up at the point that is, tilted more away, up at the Earth's surface. You might look at it sometime or make yourself a little model if you have trouble grasping that. But God established it so. God appointed and set it here for signs, for identifying distinctions of time. The basis of identifying time is the reason this was set. For seasons, He said. Now, the word that's translated seasons here is a word that we're going to find throughout the Old Testament. It is the word that is used in Leviticus 23 when God spoke in Leviticus chapter 23 and said back here in verse 2, Leviticus 23, verses 1 and 2, the Eternal spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, The appointed seasons of the Eternal, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my appointed seasons. Now, the word seasons here in Leviticus 23:2 is exactly the same word that is used for season right here in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 14. The seasons had to do with the appointed times. God's festivals are referred to as appointed seasons because there is a seasonal basis to God's festivals. And we're going to see that a little more clearly as we go through why God set it so. Now, the newspaper referred to the fact that Ramadan is a movable feast. And it is, or a movable fast. They did not explain why. Mohammed, in the 7th century, sought to copy the Jewish calendar, the Hebrew calendar. He didn't get it quite right. He figured out the lunar part of it, but the calendar takes a little bit of calculation because it is both a solar and a lunar calendar. He couldn't figure out how to correlate the two, and so he just kept it on a strictly lunar basis, which means that it has no connection with the seasons. You see, if you have a 30-day month, 12 30-day months is 360 days. And actually, a lunar month would be slightly less than that. It would be about 355 days would be the average length of a lunar year. Because a lunar month is only about 29 and a half days, which means, 29 days one month, 30 days the next month. Evens out. Because that's how long it takes the moon to go around the earth. Now, if you just calculate on that basis, if it takes the earth 365 plus days, 365 days, 6 hours, some few minutes, some few seconds to go around the sun, and it only, 12 lunar months is only about 355 days, that means you're going to be losing about 10 days a year. Which means you see that you lose seasonal sequence. You can call a day, whatever it is, you can call a day December the 1st, but it doesn't make it winter. And if there is a 10-day variation, that means in 3 years you've lost the equivalent of a month. That means in 9 years you've lost the equivalent of 3 months. And so the dead of winter has moved from December all the way back to March. You would have no basis to being able to figure out, can you imagine trying to figure out the time of the year to plant and to harvest? I mean, the months would be, in one sense, irrelevant because they wouldn't bear any resemblance to they wouldn't bear any resemblance to the seasons. You would lose a month about every 3 years, which means what? About every 36 years you'd lose an entire year. You would have gone back to starting over. That's why that anybody who ever tries to calculate Muslim dates, because they use their own calendar, anybody that ever tries to calculate Muslim dates and equate them with dates used in the rest of the world has a nightmare because it's such a complicated thing because they lose a year about every 35 years that just simply drops out. So their days or their festival dates just kind of float through the year. They're not anchored to the seasons. Now, what God said in Leviticus 23 that we just read was He said, and you see, we tend to read over some of that and not to necessarily get the significance of it, but He says, "Speak to the children of Israel and say unto them, the appointed seasons of the eternal, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my appointed seasons." Now, I'm reading it out of the Jewish translation because the King James renders it slightly different. It says, "The feasts of the eternal, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts." But the Jewish translation renders it seasons, and it is the word that is used in Genesis 1:14. These are God's appointed seasons, His festivals, but the holy convocations are to be proclaimed in their seasons. You are, in verse 4, it says, "These are the appointed seasons of the eternal, even holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their appointed season." You see, there is a seasonal significance as to why God's festivals come when they do. God didn't just flip a coin. He didn't decide in some arbitrary manner. There is a spiritual lesson to be learned by the way that God established it. Now, God set things in motion. We don't have to observe in the sense of seeing the new moon to know that it occurred. Because you see, God set things in motion in a very precise way. The dates of God's festivals can be calculated centuries in advance or centuries in the past because everything works with mathematical precision. We don't have to guess how long it's going to take the earth to revolve around the sun, or how long it's going to take the moon to go around the earth. or how long it's going to take the earth to rotate on its axis. Those are things that can be calculated right to the second. They literally can be, because God set things to where they work. You know, man can make a train run pretty much on time. You know, sometimes some places and some areas they talk about, well, you can set your watch by that. Well, maybe you can, maybe you can't. Maybe off a few seconds, maybe off a minute, but it's pretty precise. Now, I don't think we have too many that run on that kind of precision today, but there was a time when certain engineers and railroads prided themselves on the fact that it ran on time. Well, you know, if man can make a train to run on time, don't you think God can make the universe to run on time? The universe defines time. God invented time for man. Time is, as we understand it, time is based upon the relationship of the earth, the sun, and the moon. It has no relevance if you're somewhere else. It has no relevance if you're somewhere else. Time was designed for man. It's relevant to man. So, well, what about other planets? Well, there's nobody on the other planets. You know, God, it's irrelevant. You know, it's irrelevant. Has no basis. You know, how many other planets have you been to? Has no relevance. It's relevant for us because God made man upon the earth. And He made man in His image, and God designed things focused in on this planet and on mankind, made in His image after His likeness, because God has a great plan and a great purpose that ultimately involves our being a part of His very family, being born into His kingdom at the resurrection, and ultimately sharing life with Him as a part of His kingdom, a part of His family forever. And at that point, time will no longer be relevant once we are immortal, once we have stepped, so this mortal is put on immortality. Once that has occurred, time won't be relevant to us anymore because we won't age, we won't deteriorate, we won't decay. Time is relevant to us because we're physical. Now, God established it so, and He established a seasonal basis. We're told in the book of Romans, chapter 3, verse 1, what advantage then has the Jew? Or what profit is there of circumcision? Much every way, chiefly because that unto them were committed the oracles of God. What is the advantage of the Jew? Unto them were committed the oracles of God, or the Word of God. That's what oracle means, the Word. Now, the oracles of God that were committed to the Jews relate specifically to three things. One thing that was committed to the Jews, the oracles of God, first thing, was the Holy Scriptures, the books of the Bible that we recognize, that we term the Old Testament, the Holy Scriptures. The written Word of God. God committed that to the Jews. And He goes on to tell us in Romans 3, what if some of them didn't believe? It doesn't matter. God used them to preserve it, to preserve the oracles of God, the Word of God, whether they understood it or believed it or not, that was irrelevant. God used them to preserve it. They were entrusted with it. They were entrusted with the written Word of God, the Old Testament. But you know they were entrusted with other things too. Two other things that were not written. They were entrusted with the knowledge of which day is the Sabbath. You may say, well, that's in the Bible. It says the seventh day. That's right. Which day is the seventh day? If you were dropped down in the middle of a desert island, you know, and had no consciousness of time, had been, kept away from a watch or anything, had no consciousness of time, you were dropped down somewhere and you didn't know what day it was, how would you figure out which day was the Sabbath? Well, you couldn't. There's no way you can look at a sunset and tell, oh, this is Tuesday, I can tell, because, boy, the sun goes down. You can't tell. The only way that you know which day is the Sabbath is because the sequence of the week has been kept and observed by someone every generation, every week, stretching all the way back to antiquity. The Jews, to them were committed the oracles of God. Part of that included the knowledge of the 7-day week. Which day is the first day, the second day, the third day, right on through the Sabbath. So they have preserved that knowledge. They've preserved that knowledge. God made it very plain to them in Exodus chapter 16, you remember, and some of them kind of scratch their head and say, well, I'm not sure, how do we know that the Sabbath day we're observing is really the one that was established at creation? We've been in Egypt a long time, a lot of things got mixed up. Well, God made it very plain. He did the miracle of the manna. He got a double portion on Friday and none came on Saturday. That happened for 40 years. By the time, at the end of 40 years, anybody ought to have been able to figure out, I think this is the 7th day. I think we can figure that out because every 7 days no manna comes, and every 6 days, on the 6th day, a double portion comes, and on the 7th day, none comes. So after a while, you kind of figure, this is evidently the 7th day. God made it very plain. And they maintained that. Certainly Jesus Christ knew which day it was. He observed the same day they observed on the Sabbath, the New Testament church. But they maintained the oracles of God, the knowledge of the 7th day. They also preserved the knowledge of the calendar, of calculating the sacred calendar. Because again, where do you start? How do you know? How do you figure out the calendar? Well, this is knowledge that God revealed to Moses and was preserved in the priesthood. It was not written down. It was not something that the individuals needed to know, needed to calculate for themselves. God told Moses that the priesthood was to announce to the people, these are the appointed seasons of the Lord. He says, these are the appointed seasons which you shall proclaim in their seasons. So, the priesthood was to announce those occasions at the appropriate time. And the knowledge of how to calculate them was knowledge that God revealed to Moses there on Mount Sinai. And Moses taught to Aaron and to the priesthood and was maintained by the priesthood down until after the time of Christ and down until the destruction of Jerusalem, at which point it was finally written down. It was preserved as oral instruction to the priesthood until the point where they were on the verge of being scattered, and then they wrote it down. Because there was no longer the basis of being able to do it there in Jerusalem in the way that they had done before. So the calculations were written down and have been preserved in written form by the Jewish community. But God's festivals have a seasonal nature. These are to be proclaimed in their seasons. And God established it so. He established the sun and the moon for signs, for the purposes of identifying time, for seasons. Both the natural seasons as we think of them, and specifically for the festival seasons, and for days and for years. The day being based on sunrise and sunset, and the year based on the earth's revolution around the sun. They are there as a basis of understanding and defining time as it relates to human beings. Now, in Exodus chapter 12, we read that the Eternal, chapter 12, verse 1 of Exodus, the Eternal spoke unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak unto all the congregation, saying, in the 10th day of this month they shall take every man a lamb according to their father's house, a lamb for a household. Now, why did he stress this month shall be to you the beginning of months? Because it represented a change. Represented a change. And there is a reason. Now, the specific month that God established here as the first month is the month that we're told at various other times in the Scripture was to be called the month Abib. A-B-I-B. Sometimes you'll see it rendered Nisan, which is that's the Babylonian or Chaldean name for the same month. Abib is the Hebrew name, and is the term that's normally used in the Bible. Certainly used prior to the Babylonian captivity. It's the original Hebrew term. Now, that month was set aside as the beginning of months here in Exodus 12. That's in the spring. That's this season of the year. That was not historically when they commemorated the beginning of the year. Have you ever noticed that many times the Feast of Trumpets is referred to as, quote, Jewish New Year? Have you ever wondered why it's sometimes called Jewish New Year? Well, it goes back to the understanding. The Jews understand that for the basis of the festivals and the basis of the sacred year, that this month is the beginning of months. They understand that. But they've also preserved the knowledge that for the civil year, for many purposes in terms of the civil year, they continued to use the fall. Now, that dates back historically to the beginning, because they have maintained the tradition that the creation account, the creation of Adam and mankind, occurred in the fall. If you just think about it a little bit, that would certainly be logical. When God created Adam and Eve, the creation was created mature. If God had put Adam and Eve in the garden in the spring, they could have looked at the beautiful flowers and all the plants that were budding out and waited 6 months to have anything to eat, because there wouldn't have been anything to harvest. The time that God started things was at the logical season of the year. It was the time when a time of harvest. It was the time when the fruit and everything was mature and it was ready to be plucked and eaten. That's the logical time to start. You don't just pluck somebody down in the middle of the season of the year and say, well, I don't know what you're going to eat. You don't know anything about eating because there's nothing here to eat yet. But I'll tell you what, when it gets here a few months from now, if you can hold out, I'll explain it to you. There's something there. That was the time. That was the time all through the patriarchal period and all the way up until the time of Moses. That was the time, the time that we recognize as the fall festival season, the seventh month of the year in the sacred calendar. That was always when the Jews and when the patriarchs, when Abraham and all the others recognized as the beginning of the year. But in Exodus 12, something new occurred. Because prior to Exodus 12, God had only dealt with individuals. He had walked with Enoch. He had dealt with Noah. He had communed with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob and with Joseph. God had dealt with individuals and their families. But beginning in Exodus chapter 12, God began to deal with a church. Verse 3 of Exodus 12, speak you unto all the congregation of Israel. The congregation of Israel. The first time that term is used. Here God began to deal with a congregation, with a church. Now the Sabbath was made for man. And it was established when man was made. Back in Genesis chapter 2. But here, God begins to deal with a congregation, with a church, and He introduces the annual occasions, the annual festivals, which are introduced at this point, because they have relevance for the congregation, for the church. Now, God proposed to begin His festivals in the spring, not in the fall, because there is a relationship between the spiritual significance of these occasions and the season of the year in which they fall. We are told in Exodus chapter 23 that there are 3 times or 3 seasons in the year that we are to appear before the eternal our God. In Exodus 23:14, it says, 3 times you shall keep a feast unto me in the year. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. Verse 15, you shall eat unleavened bread 7 days, as I commanded you, in the time appointed of the month Abib. So, this was the month that God told Moses to tell the Israelites in Exodus 12 was henceforth to be reckoned as the beginning of months. It was the time that they were to recognize. 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. Feast of unleavened bread you shall keep 7 days. You shall eat unleavened bread as I commanded you at the time appointed in the month Abib. For in it you came out of Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty. Now the term time appointed is that word that we had run into earlier back in Genesis 1:14, and in Leviticus 23, it's that same word, season. In the season, in the time appointed, or the season of the month of Abib. It's exactly the same word. So what we find is that here in this first month, called Abib. Now, Abib is a word that has, the meaning of which has significance. You will find that when the other festivals are mentioned, the name of the month is not emphasized. See, it goes on to say, in verse 16, in the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labors, which you sown in the field, and the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in your labors, 3 times shall all your males appear before the Eternal. Now, it goes through and it mentions the other festivals, the other 2 festival seasons, 3 festival seasons altogether, but it doesn't even mention the name of the month, or it doesn't even mention the number of the month here, much less the name of the month. When you go to Leviticus 23, you'll find that it does not emphasize the name of the month in which the Feast of First Fruits, which we normally call by its New Testament name, Pentecost, doesn't even mention the name of the month. It doesn't mention the name of the month in which trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles are celebrated. It says that it is the 7th month in Leviticus 23, and it tells us which day of that month, but it doesn't even tell us the month's name. Because the names of the other months were not important in the sense that this name, Abib, was important, because there was a spiritual significance to it. It was a term that meant green ears, in the sense of fresh, new growth. It is related, as all, any of you farm, you plant, and you eagerly anticipate when you see those fresh green shoots first beginning to come up. And that's exciting because you see the crop beginning to come up. You see those fresh green shoots. We see this season of the year as we notice and we see the buds begin to swell, and finally we begin to see that new shoot of green growth that begins to occur as the trees begin to bud out and they begin finally to leaf out and to blossom, and we see the shoots of fresh new growth. God picked the first month of the year for sacred purposes, the first month of the year for the purposes of His festivals, because God's festivals outline the plan of God's working with His church. And He starts it in the spring because He wants to emphasize that He starts at a time of new beginning, a time of fresh growth, a time of a new chance. It represents a new lease on life. The winter is a time of deadness. Winter is a time of deadness. You look and the grass is brown and the trees have lost their leaves. It's a time of deadness. And then when the spring comes, a new life begins to come forth. We begin to see all the birds, and we begin to see the plants blooming and blossoming. We begin to see the fresh green growth. Now, God's people, ancient Israel, were a people that were close to the land. And their life was regulated by the rhythms of nature, by the seasons. It was regulated by the natural world around, as is the lives of most farmers. You know, most of us, at least here in this area, are not that far removed from a time when the focus was not so much on the artificial means that man has of telling time, but was more on the natural seasons because of simply taking note of those things, the time of planting, the time of harvesting. Now, focus in here in Leviticus 23, in Numbers, Exodus, I'll get it right in a second. In Exodus 23, God focused in Exodus 23 on the fact that there were 3 seasonal periods in the year during which his festivals were to be celebrated. One had to do with the beginning of the crop. One had to do with fresh growth. It had to do with green ears. It had to do with the early new growth. That was the early spring. The second was the first fruits harvest. Other scriptures show that it was calculated. It was not set on a specific day of the month, but it was calculated by a sequence of 7 weeks elapsing from during the days of unleavened bread. And so it would always come approximately 7 weeks after Passover, just over 7 weeks after Passover. It would occur in the late spring, just prior to the onset of summer. That's the festival that we call Pentecost, which is derived from the New Testament usage. In the Old Testament, it's normally called Feast of First Fruits or Feast of Weeks. And then in the fall, in the 7th month of the year, 6 months away from the Passover season, comes the festival season that is described here in Exodus 23 as the Feast of Ingathering. Now, if you notice in Exodus 23, the emphasis by way of the names of these festivals is on the agricultural significance. The focus is on the name of the month, the time appointed, the season in the month Abib, and then we find first fruits harvest and Feast of Ingathering. Now, in other places, if you were to go and you were to see these festivals outlined, you will see that they are also called the Feast of Weeks and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, different names tell you different things. Feast of Ingathering focuses in on the agricultural aspect of that feast, that it is the time that celebrates the great harvest, the great fall harvest. You see, one thing you know when you look at if you go out on the night to be much observed, if you step outside and the sky is clear, you'll see a full moon. That's just the way it is. You know, you'll see a full moon. Moon will always be full. Another thing you will always know is that exactly 6 months from now will be the Feast of Tabernacles. First night of the Feast of Tabernacles. I remember over the years, one of the things that my family and I enjoyed in Big Sandy, walking out of the tabernacle in the evening after the first service that began the Feast of Tabernacles, and we could look and up over the pine trees back in the Piney Woods campground. We could see a big full moon, and generally the skies were clear enough that you could see that very beautiful sight. And you could always count on the fact that it was going to be a full moon. Never going to be a half moon. Never going to be a crescent. It's always going to be a full moon. If it's not a full moon, you're there at the wrong time. Somebody made a slip up somewhere because the very nature of being the 15th day of the month is that it's the middle of the month, which is full moon. And the month starts with a new moon, which is the very first little sliver of light that becomes visible as the moon begins to wax greater and greater and on out to become a crescent and then and a half and a full moon, which is full moon is 2 weeks into the sequence. So God established things in this way, and He focused in on His plan as defined agriculturally. A time of fresh start, a time of new growth, a time that represents, secondly, the Pentecost season, a time of the harvest of the first fruits, a small harvest, an early harvest, the celebration of completion of that. The final festival season, the third festival season in the fall, focuses in on the great celebration of the great ingathering, the great final harvest. Just as we understand that the early spring festivals, the Passover and the Days of Unleavened Bread, focus in on the beginning of God's plan, our opportunity to have a fresh start, a new lease on life. The Pentecost season focuses in on God calling out a church. That's why there's only a handful being called in this age. That's the first fruits. God is calling out simply a first fruits. That's the beginning of His plan. But ultimately, God is going to gather in all mankind into His kingdom. And the fall festivals focus in on a time of great celebration, the time when all humanity will be gathered in to be under the rulership of the kingdom of God. And so we focus in these three seasonal accounts. Now, when we're told in Exodus chapter 12 that instructions were given in terms of each household was to take a lamb, and they were, in verse 6, to keep it until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole congregation was to kill it at dusk, and they were to take of the blood and to put it on the side posts of the house, and they were to not allow anything to remain until morning, verse 10. And we're told that it was to be eaten in haste, verse 11. It is the Eternal's Passover. Verse 12, for I will go through the land of Egypt in that night, and I will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Eternal. And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where you are, and when I see the blood I will pass over you, and there shall no plague be upon you to destroy you. When I smite the land of Egypt, this day shall be unto you for a memorial. You shall keep it a feast to the Eternal throughout your generations. Keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread. Howbeit the first day you shall put away leaven out of your houses. Whosoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. In the first day there shall be to you a holy convocation, and in the 7th day a holy convocation. No manner of work shall be done in them except that which every man must eat. That only may be done of you. You notice in Leviticus 23 when it goes through that it makes a distinction between the annual festivals and the weekly Sabbaths. You might go through there and notice because there is a distinction that is made in terms of work. That the Sabbath on the annual festivals, with the exception, of course, of the Day of Atonement, there is permitted a degree of food preparation that is not appropriate. Certainly not appropriate for atonement because we don't prepare any food at all, don't eat any food. But it's also not appropriate for the weekly Sabbath. It mentions that in Leviticus 23, that there is a distinction that is there because it makes the distinction on the other festivals except in terms of food, that it is appropriate that more cooking and more food preparation be done on those occasions because they are they are annual festive occasions. And when a holy day, when an annual festival coincides with a weekly Sabbath, the annual festival takes precedence over the weekly Sabbath because the annual occasions are called high Sabbaths. They are high days. They are days that stand out. In other words, if the Day of Atonement lands on a weekly Sabbath, well, atonement takes precedence. We fast on atonement, even though maybe we don't normally fast on the Sabbath. If the first day of unleavened bread comes on the weekly Sabbath, which it does this year, then there are things that relating to the to the festivals that are appropriate to do, that go beyond what we would normally do, let's say on the weekly Sabbath. But it is the beginning of the festival season here, the days of unleavened bread. And we're told that in verse 17, you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. In this selfsame day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt, wherefore you shall observe this day throughout your generation by an ordinance forever. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, in other words, at evening at the close of the 14th day, which begins the 15th, you're to eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. In other words, when the sun sets at the conclusion of the 21st day, 7 days there is to be no leaven found in your houses. Whosoever eats that which is leavened, that soul is to be cut off from the congregation. Verse 20, you shall eat nothing leavened. In all your habitation shall you eat unleavened bread. Now we find that there are three aspects of the commandment relating to unleavened bread that are to be noted. One is we are to have put away leavening out of our homes. We are to unleaven. Now the word leavening in the Hebrew language is a word that is derived from a term that means to ferment. Relates directly to the leavening process in bread, which is a fermentation type process. It utilizes yeast. The common method, of course, used by the ancient Israelites was what we would term sourdough. They didn't run down to the store and buy a package of Flashman's yeast. They didn't, reach in their cupboard and pull out baking soda or baking powder. Those are modern derivatives to accomplish what they accomplished the old way by either saving back starter or by mixing up a mixture of flour and water and a little sweetener. You mix that up, set it out, and it'll leaven. You can make your own starter. That's just the way it works. You set it out because there are yeast spores in the air, and it'll begin to bubble and work in a little while, and you can have sourdough starter, and you can save back starter and use it as the basis of new bread, or you can start from scratch. That's why unleavened bread was normally the bread of haste. If you wanted to make bread in a hurry, you made it unleavened because you didn't have time to let it set out and rise. You didn't have time to let it sour, and you didn't have time to let it rise. So if they were in a hurry, they made unleavened bread. We'll see that. May even take a sermon to even go through some of the significance of unleavened bread. When we're to get rid of the leavening, we are to avoid eating leavening during these days. And thirdly, we are to eat, as a positive command, we're to eat unleavened bread. See, that's what it tells us here in Exodus 12, three aspects. Get rid of the leavening, don't eat leavening, and in its place, to eat unleavened bread. See, it's not just the days of no bread at all, because that misses part of the significance. Now, there is a spiritual significance. You see, we go through and we read about how that they were to take and kill the lamb, and they put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost, and the death angel passed through, and it smote all the homes that were not under the blood of the lamb. But when you go to John chapter 1, we read that John the Baptist said of Jesus Christ, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." Jesus Christ came as the personification of the Lamb of God. He came to take away the sins of the world, because by the shedding of the blood of bulls and goats, there is no remission of sin. We went through the book of Hebrews this past Tuesday evening, and we went through the fact that there is only a remembrance made of sin. We focus on the fact that we have sinned, and that the shedding of blood is necessary for the penalty to be paid, because the wages of sin is death. But the blood of a bull or a goat doesn't wash away sin. But Jesus Christ offered Himself as one sacrifice for sin forever. He bore that penalty. He paid it. He shed His blood. He poured out His life on the ground. He died in our stead. He took your place and my place. When He was hanging there, He was there in our place, because that's where you deserve to be. That's where I deserve to be. We were the ones that deserved to be hanging there with our life's blood ebbing out on the ground. We were the ones that had sinned. He stepped in and took our place. He took your place. He took my place. He paid that penalty in our sin. God commends His love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. We're told in Romans chapter 5. Not because we deserved it, not because we had earned it, not because you'd gotten good enough and God was so impressed He thought He ought to do something in your behalf. God commends His love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. He took our place. But see, Romans chapter 6 verse 1 goes on to say, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Oh, since God's got a lot of mercy, a lot of grace, we just might as well go ahead and live in sin because God will take care of it. No, that's why the days of unleavened bread come immediately after the Passover. The Passover focuses on God's mercy. God spared Israel. Those who came under the blood of the Lamb were spared from the death angel. They didn't die when the death angel passed through the land. But God didn't spare them so they could stay in Egypt, did He? God didn't spare their lives so they could remain in Egypt as slaves. God spared their lives so that they would be alive to begin the journey out of Egypt. God let them live so He could bring them out. God spares our life to bring us out of Egypt. God commends His love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Then we're told just a few verses down in Romans chapter 6 and verse 1, what then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid! How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? We can't live in sin. If we come under the shed blood of Jesus Christ, we have to begin to come out of sin. Israel was told to put the leavening away, to get rid of it for that period. 7, of course, is a number of completion. So it symbolized completely getting rid of it. The leavening was what caused the bread to puff up, to rise. It is used as a type of sin. In the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul focuses in on that. He talks about the leaven of malice and wickedness. See, leavening spreads, it tends to permeate. Any of you ladies ever break bread, you put in just a little bit of leavening and you work it into the whole lump. It spreads, it permeates. And the whole loaf rises. Not just one little spot on it pops up, the rest of it stays flat. I've never seen any bread like that. If you have some, then you had a problem somewhere along the line. That's not the way it's supposed to turn out. The whole thing rises because the leavening spreads, it permeates through the loaf. And that process that goes through, and normally in our modern sense, yeast, baking soda, and baking powder are the three main things that leaven. Technically, yeast leavens in the full biblical sense of fermentation, but baking soda and baking powder by a chemical process duplicate that. The fermentation process is a natural process by which carbon dioxide is given off and causes the dough to rise. That's where all the little tiny bubbles come from. In there as the carbon dioxide is given off in that process. The use of baking soda and baking powder duplicate by chemical means that process and accomplish the same thing. So, technically, there's a slight difference, but it for all intents and purposes, it duplicates the same thing. And so we would understand that yeast, baking soda, baking powder, products made from them, as well as, of course, sourdough, which is not something we customarily use that much in this area. Some we do, but those things would be gotten rid of. Those ingredients plus those products that are made from that. We get rid of it prior to the sunset on the first holy day. We get rid of the leavening. It's symbolic of getting the sin out of our lives. But we don't just create a vacuum. We don't just go 7 days with nothing. It's the 7 days of unleavened bread. Because just as Paul talked about the leaven of malice and wickedness, he also talked about the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Sin has to be replaced by righteousness. Malice and wickedness must be replaced by sincerity and truth. We get rid of something and we put something else in its place. So the days of unleavened bread focused in on three things: getting rid of the leavening, not eating leavening, and in its place, eating unleavened bread. There are a variety of things that are unleavened, both commercially as well as things that you can make at home. There have been some recipes in the worldwide news. Any of you who are newer and maybe not familiar, talk to some of the members who have been around for a while. They can give you some pointers and give you some recipes that they have used. You can, in terms if you're not sure on something, check the box, check the label, check the ingredients. Normally it'll say yeast or baking soda, baking powder, or it may say bicarbonate of soda, which is just simply baking soda. If you have a question, you can check. They be glad to answer that. But normally most of your breads, such as most of your breads and crackers, are leavened. Occasionally, some cereals you have to just check the box, which are technically a bread product. Bread doesn't just mean a piece of toast. It's talking about a product that's made from, bread is a variety of things. It can be anything from biscuits to cornbread to pancakes to loaves of bread or hamburger buns or saltine crackers. I mean, all of these are bread products and things that derive that. Some things may use bread crumbs. It's just bread just crumbled up. So it can be a variety of those things. It tends to make us conscious. But, we ought to be conscious of something far more than simply looking for the bread. We ought to be conscious of looking at and examining our lives. God gives us a festival plan. God gives us His plan, reveals His plan in the context of the festivals. It is revealed seasonally in the fact that God has set the sun and the moon to interrelate with the earth in a way that creates time and that signifies the meaning of time. God has a plan and a purpose. He outlines that in the Scriptures. We are walked through it every year. The things that we go through are to remind us of what God really is doing. God gives us certain things that we are to take note of, that we are to recognize, that we are to celebrate. He tells us on these occasions, He tells us that these are holy convocations. That means commanded assemblies made holy by God. We are told that we are to assemble before Him. And we are to be instructed in His plan. These are occasions that we are to take note of, that we are to celebrate, because we are to focus in on the meaning and the significance of what the great God is doing in our lives, in your life and in my life. We are at a season of the year that focuses in, that highlights God's mercy, God's compassion, the opportunity we have for a fresh start. But that fresh start is predicated upon the fact that we are starting to go somewhere. Israel was spared in Egypt so they could leave. They were spared, their lives were spared, the lives of the firstborn were spared so that they would be able to start the journey out of Egypt to freedom. They were spared to leave Egypt. God offers us salvation not to save us in our sins, but to save us from our sins. He makes possible the opportunity for life so that we may have the opportunity to come out of this world, to be separate from and distinct from it. in every aspect of our lives. We need to examine our lives at this time of the year, certainly going beyond just simply examining our cupboards and examining our pantry and looking for the leavening. That's fine, but as we walk through symbolically, as we walk through the physical process of unleavening, and as we are conscious of this season of the year that God appoints, we are to have our attention focused on examining our lives, on looking in our hearts, recognizing that we have the opportunity for a fresh start. We have the opportunity for new growth. We have the opportunity for new beginning. God in His mercy makes it possible. He commends His love toward us, and that while we are yet sinners, Christ died for us. But He died for us so that we might be free to leave the old behind. That we may be free to turn our backs on sin. And with God's help to go forward, to be made conformable to His image through His power. We'll focus in more directly on these occasions and on their meaning and on their significance. But as we approach this season of the year, we need to be very deeply conscious. We stand today on the first day of the first month of God's sacred year. It began last night at sunset. That's why at exactly 2 weeks from last night, we will be on the day that begins the 15th day of the first month, the day that is the first holy day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Let's focus in on God's plan and on God's purpose and on the opportunity we have to be a partaker of it.